"Please, don't hurt me, I'll work," she begged, but the silent single dad rancher said only, "Come home." Silverbrook, Wyoming Territory. Winter of 1882. The morning had no color. A thick blanket of fog lay heavy over the town of Silverbrook, softening the sharp lines of buildings and muffling the usual clatter of hooves and market carts. Snow drifted from the sky like forgotten confetti from a party long over. It was winter's grip, gray, bitter, endless. The townsfolk shuffled between stalls at the open-air market, collars high and shoulders hunched. Steam curled from pie tins and coffee mugs. People talked in hushed tones, hands rubbing against the cold as they traded coins for bread or medicine. The church bell rang once, long and low, echoing through the valley like a ghostly memory. Then, silence. Heads turned. Conversation slowed. Through the haze walked a woman in white. Clara Grace, 24, barefoot in the snow, moved as though each step cost her something dear. Her wedding dress, once delicate lace and silk, now hung in muddy tatters around her ankles. Her hair was tangled, cheeks raw with wind. Clutched to her chest was a small wooden box. Inside, a folded handkerchief, an unworn ring, and an unsigned marriage license. Yesterday was supposed to be her wedding day. But there had been no groom. Only a note. And silence. And shame. She moved between stalls, trying to ask for work, her voice soft but steady. "I can clean. I can sew. Please, I just—" But each offer was met with side eyes or awkward turns away. At the bakery, the owner's wife whispered behind cupped hands, "A bride left at the altar, no wonder." At the general store, a man snorted, "She must have done something. Men don't just vanish." No one wanted a woman in a wedding dress with tear-stained cheeks, especially not one who looked like she might shatter if you touched her. Clara gripped the box tighter and turned back toward the center of town. That was when it happened. A drunken man, broad-shouldered, red-faced from too many swigs of winter whiskey, stepped in front of her, his voice slurred, loud and cruel. "Well, look what the wind blew in. You waitin' for your groom, sweetheart? Or did you wander out hoping some fool might take you in?" People gathered. Clara tried to step around him. He blocked her. "Maybe you're just looking for attention, crying in white to catch another rich one." And then he shoved her. The crowd gasped, but no one moved. Clara fell backward, her box hitting the ground. The lid snapped open. The ring rolled, shining briefly before vanishing into a slush puddle. Her head struck the cobblestones, not hard, but hard enough. Laughter rippled through the onlookers. She didn't move, just stared up, snow falling on her face. And then, small footsteps. A boy, no older than 4, ran through the crowd. He wore a wool coat 2 sizes too big, and mittens that didn't match. He knelt beside her, gently lifted the handkerchief from the mud, and pressed it into her palm. "Don't cry, lady," he said softly. "It's okay now." His name was Micah Stone. Before Clara could answer, a shadow fell over them. Elijah Stone stood at the edge of the scene, 30 years old, tall and broad, a beard dusted with frost, arms like oak trunks. He wore a thick wool coat and iron-stained gloves. The blacksmith, silent, watchful. No one had noticed him arrive. He stepped forward, shrugging off his coat. Without a word, he bent, lifted Clara to her feet, and wrapped the coat around her shoulders. His eyes held hers, steady, unreadable, but not unkind. Clara flinched, stepping back. "Please," she whispered, "don't hurt me. I can cook. I can clean. Anything. Just don't." Her voice broke. Elijah didn't speak. He simply looked at her, eyes deep and steady as the river in winter. Then, finally, he spoke. His voice was low, measured, quiet as snow. "Come home." The stone house stood at the end of a narrow path, dusted with snow, gray and cold like the mountain behind it. Built with rough-hewn slabs, its chimney puffed only a thin line of smoke, as if unsure it had permission to rise. Elijah walked ahead, boots crunching over frost-bitten ground. He didn't speak, didn't glance back. But when he reached the door, he pushed it open and waited. Clara hesitated on the porch. Micah darted past her, his tiny boots tapping over the wood floor as he ran inside. She stepped over the threshold. Inside, it was sparse but clean. A wooden table, 3 chairs, a stone hearth with a low burning fire, hooks for coats, blankets folded in a chest. No sound but the faint whistle of wind through the shutters. Micah spun in circles on a faded rug, giggling. He peeked at her from behind the chair. Elijah hung up his coat and disappeared into a back room. Clara stood frozen near the door, her hands gripping the small wooden box she still carried. The silence here was not cruel like the streets. It was heavy, solemn, but it didn't bite. She began to move. Over the next hours, Clara busied herself like a ghost. She swept the floor, though it was already clean. She refilled the kettle, though no one had asked. She sorted laundry, boiled water, folded Micah's clothes. Every movement careful. Every sound she made was followed by a glance over her shoulder. At mealtime, Elijah brought bread and stew from a cupboard, set 3 bowls, and sat down. Clara stood nearby. "Sit," he said once. She didn't move. "I can eat later," she whispered, "after you and Micah are done." He didn't insist, just lowered his head and began eating. Micah chattered about a bird he saw outside. Clara listened, hands clenched in her lap. Later, she returned to the kitchen. The fire had died down. She refilled the kettle again, trembling slightly. Her hands were numb from cold and nerves. She didn't see her own hand shaking until the kettle tipped. Scalding water splashed down her forearm. Clara gasped. She dropped the kettle. It clanged loud against the stone floor. Pain seared up her arm. She backed away, clutching the burn, eyes wide. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to. I'll fix it. I'll clean it. Please don't." Her voice cracked. She pressed herself into the corner, shoulders heaving. Elijah appeared in the doorway. He didn't yell, didn't flinch. He crossed the room, knelt beside the kettle, and turned off the stove. Then he reached for a clean cloth, wrapped ice from the cold box, and walked to her, slow. He knelt before her, wordless, and gently took her arm. Clara flinched. He paused, waiting. When she didn't pull away again, he lifted her wrist, unwrapped her grip, and placed the cold compress against the burn. She hissed softly. He began to bind it with steady, practiced hands. Still silent. Still gentle. When he looked up, his eyes were not angry. They were pained. Not from her injury, but from the way she had looked at him, as if she expected a fist. For the first time, Clara met his gaze. Not out of fear, but searching. There was no storm in his eyes, just silence. And a sadness she recognized in herself. He finished the bandage and stood. Without a word, Elijah boiled new water, made tea, poured 2 cups. He slid one across the table to her. Micah appeared with a paper in hand, scribbles in crayon. He handed it to Clara. It was 3 stick figures, smiling, a house above them, smoke curling from the chimney. "That's you," he said, pointing to the figure in a triangle dress. "And that's Papa, and that's me." Clara stared at the drawing. Her hand trembled. She covered her mouth with her burned hand and sobbed, not from pain, but because no one had ever handed her kindness without asking for something in return. Micah leaned on her shoulder. Elijah watched from the hearth, eyes low, hands curled around his mug. And for the first time in what felt like years, Clara didn't feel like a stranger inside her own skin. The wind swept low across the hills that morning, carrying with it the scent of firewood and frost. Clara stood behind the house near the wash line, her hands red from scrubbing, her fingers numb from the icy rinse. Wet linens fluttered above her like surrendering flags, and beside her, draped over a wooden stool, was the torn white wedding dress, clean at last, but still hopelessly frayed. She stared at it for a long moment. Then, slowly, she began to unbutton the back, her fingers trembling. The fabric slipped from her shoulders, fell like snow to the dirt below. She stood in Elijah's old flannel shirt now, borrowed the night before and far too big for her frame, but warm. In her hand, she held the dress like it was a snake's skin, something once part of her, but now, just a reminder of something that had tried to kill her spirit. She moved toward the fire pit, one step, then another. Just as she reached out to toss the dress onto the coals, a small voice called out, "Wait." Clara froze. Micah came running across the yard, boots untied, cheeks pink from the cold. He held something in both hands, a pair of small shoes, scuffed but polished to a soft shine, brown leather, tiny brass buckles. He looked up at her with big, serious eyes. "Papa said to keep these, for someone good." Clara looked down, speechless. Micah gently placed the shoes on top of the folded dress she held. "They're yours now." For a moment, time stopped. No wind, no fire, just a boy offering something precious, something saved, not out of duty, but because his heart had already decided she belonged here. Clara's eyes welled. She knelt before Micah, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why me?" Micah shrugged, thoughtful. "You make breakfast taste better, Papa smiles more, and you read with voices." A laugh escaped her lips, a real one, light and surprised. It was the first time she had laughed since arriving, the first time it hadn't hurt. Behind them, a quiet sound, boots on wooden steps. Elijah stood on the back porch, leaning against the post, arms folded. He hadn't said a word, but his eyes held something warm. He had seen everything, said nothing, and somehow that meant more. Clara glanced at him, meeting his gaze for a heartbeat longer than before. She rose slowly, still holding the dress and the shoes. "I won't burn it," she said softly, unsure if she was speaking to Micah or Elijah. "But I won't wear it again either." Micah nodded, satisfied, and darted back toward the barn, where a wooden horse awaited him. Elijah didn't move. Clara walked past him on the steps, and as she did, he spoke, not loud, not soft, just steady. "Some things get torn," he said, "but that don't mean they don't matter." Clara paused, then kept walking, inside, into warmth, into something new. The dress remained folded on the porch rail, the little shoes placed gently on top. A memory, a farewell, a beginning. The days began to settle into something gentle. Clara found rhythm in the hush of the hills and the creak of wood beneath her boots. She woke before sunrise, boiled water, and swept the porch while the sky was still gray. By mid-morning she sat outside with Micah, teaching him letters with a stick in the dirt. "This one's your name," she told him, guiding his little hand. "Micah." Micah wrinkled his nose, proud. "What about yours?" She smiled faintly and drew her own. "Clara." The boy traced it twice, then grinned up at her. "I'll remember." Inside, the evenings were warm and quiet. Clara discovered a chest in the attic filled with old books, tales of adventure, animals, and fables from far places. She began reading aloud to Micah each night, her voice soft beside the firelight. He listened with wide eyes and swinging legs, leaning against her side. Elijah, always nearby but never intruding, often returned from the barn with mud on his boots and calluses on his palms. She noticed how he fixed the latch on the chicken coop, how he rehung the crooked gate with care, and every time he came in, the kettle was hot, the coffee poured, always waiting. He never said thank you. He didn't have to. They moved like clockwork now, 3 hands on the same timepiece, each marking their own space, yet in sync. But the silences still hung, thick with what hadn't been said. One midday, Clara sat alone on the front steps, legs tucked beneath her skirt, a notebook balanced on her knees. The wind stirred her hair. She wrote in short bursts, half-thoughts, pieces of memory, words she hadn't let out in a long time. She didn't hear Elijah approach until his shadow crossed the page. "You write?" he asked, voice low as ever. Clara looked up, startled. Then, slowly, she nodded. Her fingers lingered over the paper before she reached into her coat pocket and handed him a folded, yellowing article. He unfolded it carefully. The headline read, "Railroads and Ruin, the Price of Greed in the East." "I used to be a journalist," Clara said, eyes on her lap. "Covered corruption, war profiteering. Thought I could change the world with ink." Elijah studied the paper in silence. His eyes moved slowly, deliberately. When he looked up, something unreadable flickered in his gaze. Clara continued, quieter now. "I once had a voice, but after what happened I stopped wanting to shout. Now I just want someone to hear me, without judging." Elijah didn't answer, but his gaze softened. That was enough. That evening, after Micah had fallen asleep, curled near the hearth, Clara sat at the kitchen table, nursing a cup of tea. The oil lamp cast a golden glow over the worn wood. She looked up at Elijah, who sat by the door polishing his boots. "What happened to Micah's mother?" she asked gently. He paused. The brush stilled in his hand. The silence stretched long before he spoke. "She left," he said, voice flat. "Ran off with a banker from Chicago. Said she wanted silk sheets and crystal windows." Clara's throat tightened. "Micah was just 2, he added more quietly. "Didn't cry once. Just kept looking at the door." He set the boot aside, looked into the flame. "I stopped talking much after that," Elijah murmured. "Figured silence doesn't leave like people do." Clara didn't offer comfort, didn't reach out with pity. She simply nodded, meeting his eyes with quiet understanding. Two people, both abandoned, finding each other in the stillness between words. From that night on, something shifted. Elijah started saying a little more. Weather talk, short questions, the occasional warning about coyotes near the henhouse. And Clara, in turn, began leaving little notes tucked into corners. "Soup's hot by the fire. You forgot your gloves. Micah says you hum when you hammer." He never replied to the notes, but he kept them. They still hadn't used each other's names. Still said sir and miss like strangers playing house. But in the way their eyes met across a quiet room, in the way Elijah filled her teacup before she asked, or the way Clara folded his shirts a little neater than necessary. Something was growing. Something real. The afternoon sun was warm, rare for winter in Silverbrook. Clara knelt in the garden behind the house, pulling at stubborn roots with her sleeves rolled up, while Micah darted between rows of cabbage, chasing a moth. "Do you think bugs dream?" Micah asked, eyes full of wonder. Clara smiled, brushing dirt from her cheek. "If they do, I hope it's of flowers." The boy laughed, ran toward a pile of hay at the far edge of the fence. Clara straightened, wiping her hands, just as she noticed movement, something too smooth, too quiet, slithering along the edge of the straw. Her heart stopped. "Micah, stop." The child froze. A rattlesnake, thick and black-spotted, coiled near his boot. Clara didn't think. Her body moved before her mind caught up. She lunged, swept him aside, felt the sting before she saw it. The fangs sank into her forearm, sharp, burning. Pain lanced through her. She fell to her knees with a gasp, clutching her arm. Micah screamed. "Elijah," Clara rasped, trying to calm the child even as her vision blurred. "Run, get your pa." The boy bolted toward the house, barefoot, shouting. Moments later, heavy boots thundered across the yard. Elijah appeared, eyes wide, rifle forgotten in his hand. "She's bitten," Micah sobbed, pointing. Elijah dropped the rifle, fell to his knees beside her. "Hold still," he ordered, voice shaking. Clara could barely breathe. "Snake." "I see it," he said, pulling a knife from his belt. With quick, practiced hands, he sliced near the bite, sucked at the wound, spat, and repeated. His hands were shaking. For the first time since she met him, truly shaking. Blood, dirt, sweat. He wrapped her arm in clean cloth, torn from his own sleeve, lifted her carefully, cradling her like something breakable, and carried her inside. Micah followed close behind, clutching the old embroidered handkerchief his mother had once made. Inside, Elijah laid Clara on the bed near the fire. He stoked the flames higher, fetched water, mixed herbs, his movements fast, focused, desperate. Micah crawled up beside Clara and placed the handkerchief over her bandaged arm, whispering, "This always made me feel better when I was sick." Clara couldn't speak. Her lips were blue. Her eyes fluttered. Elijah sat beside her, dabbing her forehead, murmuring something low and rough under his breath. He didn't sleep. All night he stayed at her side, checking her pulse, changing the cloth, brushing hair from her face. And all night his hand never left hers. By morning the fever began to break. Clara stirred, groaned softly. Her lashes fluttered open, and she saw Elijah, head resting on the edge of the bed, hand still holding hers. He had fallen asleep sitting up, exhaustion etched into every line of his face. She blinked slowly and smiled. When Elijah sensed movement, he jolted awake, eyes immediately on her. "You're back," he said, voice raw. Clara's voice was hoarse but steady. "Didn't mean to scare you." He didn't reply, just stared at her with something close to pain in his eyes. "You didn't have to," he began, then stopped. "I did," she whispered. "He's just a boy." Elijah looked down, tightening his grip on her hand. "He's everything I've got." Clara nodded, breath shallow. "Then we protect him, together." It wasn't a confession. It wasn't a promise. But in that room, in the soft light of dawn and the smell of burned-out firewood, something unspoken was sealed. Not with words, but with hands held and fear shared. Micah peeked around the doorframe, clutching his blanket. "Is she okay now?" he asked, wide-eyed. Clara turned her head slowly and smiled. "Getting there." The boy ran in, climbing up beside them. Elijah reached to steady him, but Clara was already pulling Micah close, her good arm wrapping around him. And in that moment, the three of them, wounded, weary, warm, sat together, tangled not by blood, but by something deeper. They didn't call it family yet. But they would. They would. The snow had begun falling again, soft, delicate flakes dancing outside the windows of the stone house. Inside, Clara was folding laundry near the fire, her arm still tender but healing. Micah was asleep upstairs, clutching the handkerchief like always. Elijah returned from the mailbox at the end of the trail, face unreadable as he handed Clara a small, wrinkled envelope. No return address. Just her name. Clara froze. Her fingers trembled as she broke the seal and unfolded the note. The handwriting was sharp, familiar. "You humiliated me. You'll come back and make this right, Clara. This isn't over. I'll come for you soon. You still wear my name." No signature, just the stink of control she'd tried to outrun. She dropped the letter as if it had burned her. Elijah stooped, picked it up. He read it once, quietly. His jaw tightened. But he didn't speak. He only walked to the fire, let the flames lick the edge of the letter, and dropped it in. It curled black and vanished into ash. Dinner was quiet that night. Micah babbled happily about learning the letter M. Clara smiled, but her hands shook as she passed the bread. Elijah didn't say a word, but something inside him shifted. After Micah had been tucked in, Clara stood at the sink, staring out at the darkened hills. Behind her, Elijah cleared his throat. She turned. He was holding something wrapped in waxed cloth. "I've got something," he said, voice low. He unwrapped it gently, an old newspaper article, folded so many times it was nearly falling apart, yellowed edges, ink fading. He laid it on the table between them. Clara stared. Her own name beneath the headline. "Whistleblower exposes railroad bribery. Eastern reporter risks life for the truth." Her breath caught. I wrote this," she said, voice barely audible. "I know," Elijah replied. She looked up, confused. "I've had it 5 years," he said, eyes on the paper, not her. "Found it in a bundle of scrap they used to wrap horseshoes. Almost threw it away." "Why didn't you?" He hesitated, then looked at her. "Because it made me believe there were still people brave enough to stand for something. I read it every winter. Every time I thought the world forgot what decency looked like." Clara felt her chest tighten. She reached for the page, running her fingers over the words she had once poured her soul into. "I used to think words could change the world," she said softly. "Then I found out some men only want to change you." He shook his head. "That man, he's wrong. You didn't shame his name. He never earned yours." Her eyes welled. "Elijah, why did you keep it all this time?" He didn't blink. "Because I saw you long before you came here." Silence settled, heavy but warm. The fire popped. Clara finally whispered, "You never told me why you helped me that day, at the market." He nodded once. "Because I've seen enough people walk away when someone's down. I wasn't gonna be one of them again." Her lips trembled. In that moment, something old and wounded inside her loosened, just a little. She sat beside him, shoulder brushing his. Neither spoke for a while. Then she leaned her head on his arm. Not seeking comfort. Just choosing stillness. The first anyone saw of him was the glint of polished boots stepping off the stagecoach. Tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a dark city coat and gloves too fine for Silverbrook, the man moved like he expected doors to open for him. His name was Charles Whitmore. And he was Clara's husband, at least on paper. He walked with a purpose, jaw clenched, eyes scanning the modest buildings of the town like they were beneath him. As he passed the saloon, two men tipped their hats out of habit, then looked at each other, frowning. By the time he reached the general store, the whispers had begun. "He's the one," a woman murmured. "The groom who left her?" another asked. "Heard he came to take her back." Charles stopped a passerby with a curt wave of his hand. "Where is Clara Whitmore? I was told she's squatting with some cattlemen out here." The man blinked, stiffened. "Miss Clara teaches at the chapel schoolhouse." Charles turned, walking down the muddy road, ignoring the curious eyes watching from behind curtains and windows. He passed the blacksmith. He passed the cafe. He passed Elijah Stone's cabin, and sneered at the sight of a child's wooden horse left in the yard. And then he found the church. Out front, beneath the shadow of the steeple, children were gathered on wooden benches, small slates in hand, mouths moving through their ABCs. Clara stood beside them, Micah seated at her feet. Her voice was calm, her smile gentle as she pointed to the letters drawn in chalk. Charles strode forward, boots thudding against stone. "Clara!" he barked. She froze. The children looked up, startled. Micah gripped her skirt. "You are coming with me," Charles said. "You think you can humiliate me, run off and play schoolteacher like some frontier ghost? You belong to me. You are my wife." Clara's voice trembled. "I was never yours. You made sure of that." He took a step closer. Behind them, the church doors creaked. Elijah Stone stepped out into the sunlight. Sleeves rolled, face shadowed beneath his wide hat. He walked down the steps slowly, each bootstep deliberate. Charles straightened, sneering. "Ah, the cowboy." Elijah didn't respond. He didn't need to. He stopped just in front of Clara, between her and the man who'd once left bruises on her arms and called it discipline. Charles laughed once, low and sharp. "You think she's yours now? Is that how this ends? She runs from me into the arms of a grunting animal who digs in the dirt?" Still, Elijah said nothing. Then he moved. One punch, swift, brutal, final. Charles collapsed onto the dirt, blood running from his nose, shock frozen on his face. He looked up, stunned. Elijah stared down at him, voice even. "She owes you nothing. She belongs to no one but herself." The crowd had gathered, neighbors, storekeepers, mothers with children. No one stepped in to help Charles. It was the pastor who walked forward next. "We don't tolerate that kind of man here. Take your coat, take your boots, take your pride, and go." Charles staggered to his feet, glare full of fury, but not courage. Not anymore. He spat blood to the ground and turned. By sunset, he was gone. Clara stood in silence, hands trembling slightly. Micah hugged her side. Elijah turned to go, but she reached for his hand. Their fingers brushed, just lightly, but in that touch there was everything. Gratitude, strength, Respect. The children began singing again behind them, their voices rising like bells through the cold air. And for the first time in a long time, Clara stood tall, seen, heard, and finally, free. The pine tree stood tall by the riverbank, its branches catching the golden light of afternoon like arms outstretched in blessing. Beneath it, a gathering of simple folk waited, faces warm and eyes bright, as if the wind itself had hushed to listen. There were no pews, no choir, just wooden benches borrowed from the chapel, wild flowers gathered in tin pails, and the gentle rustle of leaves in the breeze. Clara stood at the edge of it all, her breath caught in her chest. The dress, that dress, was no longer the symbol of shame it had once been. The jagged tear along the hem had been sewn with careful, mismatched stitches. The bodice reinforced, the mud-stained lace replaced by a trim cut from the old wedding tablecloth one of the townswomen had donated. It was still the same dress, but it had been remade, not by hands of wealth or fashion, but by hands that knew what it meant to fall and still choose to stand. Micah skipped toward her with a wreath of daisies in his little hands, his vest slightly crooked, curls bouncing in the sunday. "You look like a storybook princess," he said, beaming. Clara bent and kissed his forehead. "And you, my knight." He grinned and ran to his place beside Elijah, who waited under the pine in a clean white shirt and the same hat he wore the day they met. His coat was pressed, his boots shined, but nothing was more striking than the way he looked at her, like he was seeing a miracle. The townspeople rose as Clara walked slowly down the grass path. No music, just heartbeats, just wind, just footsteps and smiles. When she reached him, Elijah held out his hand.